Our next speaker clearly needs no introduction in an Achaemenid context. Nevertheless, I would like to introduce you Hilmar Klinkert, professor for ancient history in Kiel. And I might mention that he published a couple of months ago a study on Xerxes, and now he's coming back to his PhD thesis, in a certain sense at least, and he's talking about the satraps of the Persian Empire. Please welcome Hilmar Klinkert, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And of course, I have to thank Robert and Rahim and Astrid Gree for this wonderful conference and this very, very inspiring situation here. Because of time, I just want to go medias in res. Ladies and gentlemen, if territorial expansion and a developed, concise administration and infrastructure are characteristics of an empire, every empire has to manage the transition process from expansion to the development of a comprehensive inner organization. The Persian Empire of the T-Speeds and Achaemenids II was faced to this task. After a phase of very dynamic expansion, and an integration process started since Darius I at the latest to form a self-contained political and administrative entity. Bruno Jacobs rightly emphasized the difficult procedure to integrate the former local kingdoms and other polities into the territory of the Achaemenid Empire and to transform them into its later administrative units, the satrapies. Viewed to this process, it does not wonder that the satraps under Darius I and Xerxes I seem to be mainly occupied with duties of inner administration. The close dependency of the satraps to the great king in question of foreign policy and in expansion in particular is exemplified by the attempt of Aristagoras to conquer Naxos under the authority of the Lydian satrap Artaphernes in 500–499 BC. Herodotus in Book 531 clearly analyzes by the words of Aristagoras the strategic importance of the island for the control of the Cyclades and for an attack against Euboea. Artaphernes understood the idea of Aristagoras as a proposal to the great king, and therefore he explicitly stated, "The king too, however, must himself contend to this." Only by the specific order of Darius I, Artaphernes was able to prepare the campaign for which not the satrap himself, but the royal commander was delegated. Herodotus clearly shows that the satrap is not the commander of the campaign and not the conqueror of the new territories, but only an intermediary in communication to the great king. At the beginning, foreign policy do not seem to be part of the satrapal duties, but a royal task in principle. Anyway, the Greek campaign of Xerxes was an essential turning point of the royal policy in general. After Xerxes, no other Achaemenid Great King intended a further conquest of Greece or another systematic territorial expansion. Instead, the royal policy changed to a phase of constituting an imperial territory within fixed borders and thus developed the regional awareness of being part of an empire. It is the Aegean inscription IG 4556 which perfectly illustrates this policy under late Achaemenid conditions, clearly realized by the Greeks in the time of Artaxerxes III in lines 8–12. This change in the royal policy affected substantial consequences in two main aspects. Firstly, the legitimization and position of the great king, and secondly, the role and competences of the satraps, in particular at the western border of the empire in Asia Minor. Concerning the first aspect, after the Greek campaign of Xerxes, all Achaemenid great kings dissociated from further expansion in political praxis. This policy conflicted with the ideological concept of royal representation. The Achaemenid inscriptions usually start with a presentation of royal legitimacy in various aspects, as for example, a territorial one by the possession of the empire. In some cases, it is illustrated by the so-called Dahiyava list, the country or peoples list, documenting the constant increase of the empire by the enumeration of countries as an essential indicator for a successful and legitimate royal policy. With the ending of the expansion policy, the ideological pattern of imperial increase seems to be kept illustrated by a multiplication of countries already nominated. By specified differentiation, we are informed, for example, on several saga groups or yauna, which are determined at the sea, in the sea, and beyond the sea. Nevertheless, the Dahiyawa lists as an element of legitimization in the royal representation seem to disappear since Xerxes I. It is only an inscription of Artaxerxes III, and certainly not by accident, which presents once more an enumeration of countries. Against this background, it was difficult for the great kings after Xerxes to present themselves as successful conquerors. The disappearance of the Dahiyawa list in the royal inscriptions and thereby the partial forfeiture of some ideological patterns in royal representation may indicate an attenuation of the range in which the great king was able to demonstrate his legitimacy. On the other hand, the role of the great king as the only representative of the empire as political entity seemed to come more and more to the fore. Obviously, the new royal policy stands for an intensified focus on the imperial territory, the conservation of its extent, in particular by the protection of its borderlines. However, the political practice to stabilize a limited territory with fixed or defined borders, and thereby the acceptance of other political entities outside the empire, contradicted the idea of the great king's universal rule. From this point of view, too, the conditions of practical politics modify the presentation form of the royal ideology. In consequence, the great king had to change the duties and competences of the satraps as the officers who were responsible for the imperial administration at the periphery. In the proper sense of the word Satrapal, they acted as protectors of the empire. For the security of the mandated region, they got the competences to act also in foreign affairs when necessary. In concrete, the satraps were able to initiate diplomatic interaction, to negotiate political agreements, and to strengthen the military power by the recruitment of satrapal troops. For that reason, Xenophon tells us the general maxim of the Persian policy towards Greece when Tissaphernes handed over the government to the Lydian satrap in 408 to Cyrus the Younger. He says, and he advised him to see to it that no single Greek state should become strong, but that all be kept weak through constant quarreling among themselves. Certainly, the cases of bribery and miasmos in the sequel of the so-called Persian Wars, just remember prominently Themistocles in Athens, Pausanias in Sparta, or Agesilaus' departure from Asia Minor, might be understood as parts of this Persian policy. According to the satraps of Western Asia Minor, Pharnabazus in Hellespontine Phrygia at Daskylion and Tissaphernes in Lydia at Sardes supported the Athenians and Spartans with ships and money. The importance of this Persian influence, mainly on navy battles in the Peloponnesian War, is well known. The same policy may be reflected in the reign of Artaxerxes III in the Argos inscription, which reports on the communication with the satrap. Satrapal ambassadors are explicitly named as the man who has come from the satraps, discussing the relationship between the polis and the great king. So Argivian eyes the influence of the great king or of his officers, those from his country territory, on inner Greek political conditions is a key point of the regulation in the line 12 to 16, and obviously in reaction on a known practice. In a similar way, the satraps of Lydia and Hellespontine Phrygia were actively involved in contractual negotiations. Thucydides reports, for example, that the Spartans supposedly negotiated 3 contractual versions between summer 412 BC and spring 411 BC with Darius II. After the conclusion of the treaty in Thucydides 859, Thucydides hints in the same chapter that Tissaphernes only endeavors to make the impression of realizing the contractual conditions. But Thucydides 878 explains how the satraps seriously hurts the Peloponnesian fleet by shortage and disruption of the agreed maintenance payments. In summer 411 BC, Tissaphernes definitely ceased the payments and thus the contract. Indeed, Pharnabazos, the Hellespontine satrap, insisted on an alliance with the Peloponnesians and promised to pay for their ships in concurrence to Tissaphernes. At the end, Thucydides let state the Milesian Hermocrates that Tissaphernes, quotation, undid the business of the Peloponnesians with Alcibiades and dealt on both hands, eb amphoterizonta. However, according to Thucydides, Tissaphernes too sent an ambassador to Sparta as mentioned in the Argivian inscription. And in addition, Xenophon reports on a situation in Gordion in the following winter 410 and 409 BC, which illustrates the intensity of Greek diplomatic exchange and the importance of the satraps as key player even in contact to the great king. The exemplary situation of 411 perfectly illustrates the range of the new satrapal competences to initiate diplomatic influence, contractual agreements, and military and financial support. By this political scope of action, the satraps managed to control a balance of power which guaranteed to keep up the stability of administrative, economic, and political conditions in the western border satrapies. So conflicts in the border region could mainly be reduced to local areas. A central aspect in this system of precarious stability was certainly the satrapal concurrence, balancing the relation between these satraps and the great king. The range of competences and the freedom to operate in a broader regional context was intrinsically connected with the prestige of the satrapal position, mainly defined by the intensity of the officer's personal relation to the great king. So the power of the satraps was essentially shaped by the relation to and the support of the great king, who himself was strengthened in his position by the loyalty of these satraps. The legitimation and restriction in the ideological presentation of the great king seems to have been compensated by the political backing of these satraps. Of course, by the mutation of the royal policy, the power relation of the royal and satrapal positions started to change too, strengthening the mutual political dependence and enhancing the competences and functions of the satraps. The success of this policy, in particular the stabilization of political and administrative conditions, affected an economic growth in general. Due to the development of the Ionian cities, in particular of Miletus after the destruction in the Ionian Revolt 494, a certain prosperity was taking root in the satrapies of Western Asia Minor. This prosperity characterized not only the regional administrative situation, but also the personal, so to say, private one of individual Persians as rich local estate holders. This economic upswing demonstrated the legitimizing success of the great king's imperial government, especially when the latter presented himself by the ideological pattern of a good gardener. At the same time, this success denoted a new kind of reliance on the satraps, who had to transmit the regular income, taxes, tributes, and other payments to the great king, and thus guaranteed the functionality of the royal presentation. However, the satraps did not only control the finances and in their administration, but had a growing prosperity at their own disposal, by which they could enhance the concurrence to the great king, particularly triggered by the imitatio regis at the satrapal residences. The range of the financial scope of action loomed up in the usurpation of Darius II. Persian noblemen and women of the royal court society, including satraps as Arsames of Egypt, were estate holders in Babylonia, in case of Arsames, even in Egypt, who financially burdened their private funds to support Darius II and his uprising, as Matthew Stolper clearly pointed out. By their financial support, the Persians became kingmakers and thus influential political forces at the royal court and in the environment of the king. At the same time, the increase of financial resources strengthened the military power of both the great king and his satraps. Of course, military strength was a core fact for the security of a satrapy in general and of the border satrapies in particular. It does not wonder that the satraps in Western Asia Minor, when they had to act in the Aegean and the Greek world as the borderland region of the Achaemenid Empire, were equipped with special military competences. The position of the Karanos was connected with the government of the Lydian satrapy. This combination of administrative and military function with a specific title is proved since Darius II, obviously as a reaction to the new royal policy under the reign of the late Xerxes I and Artaxerxes I, and maybe as consequence to the battle at the Eurymedon. In a comparable way, the superior command of the navy traditionally was held by the satrap at Daskylion in Persian Union. Especially the case of the younger Cyrus illustrates how a member of the royal family was fitted out with extraordinary competences as Karanos of the peoples at the sea and governor of 3 satrapies, Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, obviously compensating for an existing claim to the throne. Just this specific regulation demonstrates the precarious reliance of the great king's acceptance on aristocratic and royal court members holding satrapal positions. However, a much more dangerous component for the balanced relationship between satraps and the great king became the possibility of the first to hire Greek soldiers in private initiative by their financial resources and besides the royal contingents. Certainly, this policy too was originated in a special need for protection of the satrapies in Western Asia Minor. But Cyrus' revolt demonstrated the consequences of such a policy, which combined huge administrative responsibilities with political competences, an extended diplomatic network, a certain financial autonomy, and military power. This framework of competences originated by the necessity of regional stabilization now turned into a destabilizing factor motivated by the personal political interests of the satraps. Therefore, this kind of power stimulated the concurrence to the great king and the regional tendencies of particularization as demonstrated by the so-called satrapal revolt of the 360s in Asia Minor. Of course, the great king had to correct this shift in inner administrative power by modifying the conditions of regional control and satrapal power. In consequence, Artaxerxes II and mainly Artaxerxes III systematically reduced the satrapal fields of competences. So, for example, a downsizing of territorial responsibilities can be stated in the 4th century BC. In consequence, large satrapies could be split in new satrapies, as for example Caria, maybe Ionia, as former parts of the Lydian satrapy were separated. In addition, the policy of the satrapal appointments by the kings started to change. Since the middle of the 4th century BC, the number of indigenous satraps is significantly increasing. So we know as non-Persian satraps the Carian Hecatomid dynasts, or Cyanesis and Camisares as satraps of Cilicia, maybe Datamis in Cappadocia, the Babylonian Belassis or Belshunu in Elbenari, the Elamite Abulites as satrap of Susiane under Darius III, and even maybe Mentor, the Greek mercenary commander from Rhodes, as satrap of Lydia under the late Artaxerxes III and early Darius III. Of course, this appointment policy played with the element of concurrence between Persian and non-Persian satraps, triggering the later by the perspective of social mobility to an imperial elite and to the direct royal environment. Thus, the group of non-Persian satraps is characterized by a specific loyalty towards the great king, but without competitive interests. Thereby, besides a territorial reduction, the power of the satraps might be balanced by a new elite in control of the Persian officers. Certainly, the so-called satrapal revolts in the 360s were partially motivated by this diminished satrapal status. Last but not least, the great king, in particular Artaxerxes III, reduced the military forces of the satrap, obviously after the defeat of the satrapal revolts in Asia Minor, the revolts in Cyprus, Sidon, and Egypt. A milestone of the royal policy certainly was the order of mercenary dismission in 356 BC by Artaxerxes III. Diodorus, as well as Ascolion of Demosthenes, report on this royal edict, which made 10,000 Greek mercenaries leaving the satrapal services and changing to Cabrias in the Confederate War of the Second Attic League. To conclude, in my opinion, the dynamic process of shaping the balanced relation between satrapal and royal power in reaction to the Great Kings' policy, in consequence to local developments of the satrapal position, and in defining a regional administration in an established empire is evident. It is characterized by two major phases of transformation. The first phase is characterized by the integrative transformation of the former autonomous polities to satrapies in a closed imperial entity. This phase, mainly triggered by changes of the royal foreign policy, is characterized by a stabilization of the imperial territory and its borders, and thus affected a specific extension of satrapal competences. The second phase shows a stabilizing transformation which newly regulated the balanced relationship between the Great King and his satraps. It is clearly a corrective reaction on political ambitions of the satraps, their stronger military, economic, and political position, and tendencies of royal competition or imperial particularization. But both phases are not a sign for crisis or decline, but an expression of the dynamic configuration or reconfiguration of central and subordinated powers in the administration of an empire shaping its long-term conditions. I thank you very much.